On a freezing night, in a small town, a widowed father just wanted to get home to his daughter until he opened his truck door. There, slumped across the back seat, was a woman in a torn designer dress, high heels caked with mud, and a secret worth millions. He thought he was helping a stranger, but by morning he realized he'd taken in the most powerful and most hunted businesswoman in the state. She was running from scandal, from betrayal, from people who would do anything to destroy her. Now, she's hiding in his farmhouse, bringing warmth back into a home that's been cold for years. But as the truth closes in, this single father faces a choice: protect the woman who's changing his life, or watch her be torn apart. When the law comes knocking, and the cameras won't stop flashing, will saving her cost him everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The snow fell in thick, lazy flakes as Ethan Cole pulled the heavy metal door of his auto repair shop closed. The familiar click of the lock echoed in the empty parking lot. His weathered hands, still bearing traces of engine grease despite thorough washing, fumbled slightly with the keys in the biting cold. His phone buzzed in his pocket, another message from Grace. "Dad, the weather report says it's getting worse. Please come home soon." He smiled at her concern, so much like her mother's. The day's work had been long: 3 oil changes, a transmission repair, and a stubborn radiator that had taken far longer than expected. His muscles ached, but it was honest work that put food on the table and kept Grace in her beloved art classes. Walking around to the back of the garage, where he always parked his old Ford pickup, Ethan's boots crunched in the fresh snow. The security light cast long shadows across the white ground, and that's when he noticed something wasn't right. The driver's side door of his truck wasn't fully closed, a detail that set off immediate alarm bells in his mind. He always made sure to close and lock his doors. It was habit born of small-town sensibility. Cautiously approaching the vehicle, Ethan's hand instinctively reached for the flashlight he kept in his coat pocket. The beam cut through the growing darkness, revealing nothing unusual in the front seat. But when he shifted the light to the back, his breath caught in his throat. A woman lay curled up on the bench seat, her black dress wrinkled and riding up above her knees. Her designer heels, caked with mud, had been kicked off onto the floor mat. Dark mascara streaked down her cheeks, and her carefully styled hair was now a disheveled mess. The strong smell of whiskey mixed with an expensive perfume wafted from the cabin. "Ma'am?" Ethan called out, keeping his voice gentle but firm. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman stirred slightly, mumbling something unintelligible. Her eyes fluttered, but didn't open fully, and her head lolled to the side. Ethan could see she was shivering, despite her alcohol-induced haze. He stood there for a moment, considering his options. The sensible thing would be to call Sheriff Martinez. This was exactly the kind of situation law enforcement should handle. But as another gust of bitter wind cut through his heavy jacket, he thought about how the temperature was supposed to drop well below freezing tonight. The woman clearly needed help, not a night in the drunk tank. "Okay, ma'am," he said, mostly to himself as he opened the back door. "Let's get you somewhere warm and safe." With gentle movements, Ethan carefully helped the woman sit up. She was like a rag doll, barely able to support her own weight. Up close, beneath the smell of whiskey and smeared makeup, he could see she was probably in her late 30s, with fine features that spoke of wealth and refinement, definitely not a local. "Can you tell me your name?" he tried again, supporting her elbow as she swayed. Was all she managed, her head dropping forward. Getting her into the front seat was a challenge. Ethan was strong from years of mechanical work, but he was also careful not to overstep any boundaries. He managed to guide her around the truck and help her into the passenger seat, securing her seatbelt while she mumbled incoherently. The woman's head rested against the window as Ethan started the engine. The old truck's heater wheezed to life, slowly filling the cabin with warm air. Through the thickening snowfall, the headlights illuminated the empty street ahead. Main Street was deserted, all the shops dark except for the Christmas lights that still twinkled in some windows. As he drove, taking extra care on the increasingly slick roads, Ethan kept glancing at his unexpected passenger. Her breathing had steadied, but she was still shivering. He reached behind the seat and pulled out the old blanket he kept there for emergencies, awkwardly trying to drape it over her with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel. The woman stirred slightly at his touch, turning her head toward him. Her eyes opened just a crack, revealing a flash of deep brown before closing again. "No one," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion and alcohol. "No one left to call." Ethan's brow furrowed at those words, heavy with a sadness he recognized all too well. He knew what it was like to feel alone in the world. After losing Sarah, there had been nights when the emptiness felt overwhelming. If it hadn't been for Grace. The truck's heater hummed steadily now, fighting back the winter chill as snow continued to blur the windshield. The wipers swept back and forth in a hypnotic rhythm, and the woman had slumped against the door again, her breathing evening out into what seemed like sleep. The headlights of Ethan's truck swept across the front of the weathered farmhouse, illuminating the warm glow already spilling from the kitchen windows. Snow had collected on the worn wooden porch steps, and he could see Grace's silhouette moving behind the curtains, probably pacing as she waited for him. Getting the unconscious woman out of the truck proved challenging. She stirred slightly as he carefully lifted her, one arm supporting her shoulders and the other under her knees. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could smell the expensive perfume beneath the whiskey on her breath. The front door flew open before he reached it. Grace stood there in her favorite oversized sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her eyes widened at the sight of the woman in her father's arms. "Dad? What's going on? Who is she?" "Let me get inside first, sweetheart," Ethan said, maneuvering carefully through the doorway. The warmth of the house enveloped them immediately, along with the lingering scent of the mac and cheese Grace had made for dinner. "Can you grab some extra blankets from the hall closet?" Grace nodded and hurried off, while Ethan carried the woman up the creaking stairs to their spare bedroom. The room was small but neat, with a quilted bed and simple wooden furniture that had belonged to his late wife's grandmother. He laid the woman down as gently as he could, removing only her mud-caked heels before pulling the comforter over her. Grace appeared in the doorway, arms full of blankets. "Is she hurt?" she whispered, tiptoeing into the room. "I don't think so," Ethan replied softly, taking the blankets and spreading them over the sleeping figure. "Found her in my truck behind the garage. She's had too much to drink, and it's too cold to leave her out there." He placed a glass of water from the bathroom on the nightstand, along with 2 aspirin. Back in the hallway, Grace tugged at his sleeve. "But who is she? Why was she in your truck?" "We'll have to wait until morning to find out," Ethan said, guiding his daughter downstairs. "Right now, she needs to sleep it off somewhere safe." In the living room, the fireplace crackled with warmth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Ethan sank into his favorite armchair, feeling the weight of the strange evening settling on his shoulders. Grace curled up on the couch nearby, pulling her grandmother's afghan around her shoulders. "Should we call the police?" she asked, her voice smaller now. Ethan ran a hand through his graying hair. "I thought about it," he admitted. "But it's below freezing out there, and the roads are getting worse. Sheriff Thompson would just tell me to let her sleep it off somewhere warm anyway." He tried to smile reassuringly at his daughter. "Sometimes people just need a little help, even if they end up in strange places asking for it." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "Like when Mrs. Peterson's car broke down last month, and we let her stay until her son could drive up from the city?" "Something like that," Ethan agreed, though he knew this situation felt different. The woman upstairs was clearly wealthy. Her dress alone probably cost more than he made in a month. What had driven someone like that to hide in his truck on a snowy night? The fire popped and hissed as Grace's eyes grew heavy. She fought sleep for a while, asking occasional questions about their mysterious guest, but eventually drifted off on the couch, the afghan pulled up to her chin. Ethan watched her sleep, grateful for her trusting nature but aware that he needed to be cautious enough for both of them. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily as Ethan sat in his vigil. He could hear the wind picking up outside, rattling the windows gently. Occasional creaks from upstairs made him tense, but they were just the normal sounds of the old farmhouse settling. From the spare bedroom above came the sound of movement, rustling sheets, and a soft murmur. He held his breath, listening, but there was no sound of footsteps. Instead, he caught fragments of words drifting down, "ruined everything," before silence fell again. Ethan glanced at his sleeping daughter, then back at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring answers, but for now, all they could do was wait out the night. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The sizzle of butter on the griddle filled the cozy space as Ethan flipped another golden-brown pancake onto the growing stack. The familiar rhythm of breakfast preparation helped calm his unease about their unexpected houseguest. Grace sat at the old oak table, her math textbook open, but forgotten, as she absently stirred her hot chocolate. Her eyes kept drifting to the kitchen doorway, waiting. The floorboards in the hallway creaked. Both father and daughter looked up as their visitor appeared, framed in the doorway. She'd attempted to smooth her designer dress, though it remained wrinkled from sleeping in it. Her dark hair had been finger-combed into some semblance of order, but her face was pale, and slight shadows lingered under her eyes. "Good morning," she said, her voice hoarse but controlled. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Ethan replied, sliding another pancake onto the griddle. "Have a seat. Coffee's fresh." She hesitated for a moment before moving to the table, her stockinged feet silent on the floor. Her mud-caked heels were likely still by the front door, where Ethan had placed them last night. "I'm Alexandra Pierce," she said, directing her words to both of them but watching Ethan's face carefully. "And I owe you both an apology for the intrusion." Ethan's hand stilled briefly over the pancake batter. He knew that name. Anyone who read the business section of the newspaper knew that name. Alexandra Pierce, CEO of Pierce Industries, famous for her ruthless corporate takeovers and efficiency measures that had cost thousands their jobs. "I'm Grace," his daughter piped up, breaking the moment of tension. "Would you like some hot chocolate? Dad makes it really good, with real chocolate and everything." A flicker of surprise crossed Alexandra's features, followed by something softer. "That would be lovely, thank you." Ethan poured her a mug, adding a splash of cream the way Grace liked it. As he set it before her, Alexandra's cheeks flushed slightly. "I realize how inappropriate this all is," she said quietly. "Last night was not my finest moment. I had an unfortunate evening at a business dinner and things." She trailed off, looking down at her hands. "You're safe here," Ethan said simply, returning to his pancakes. "That's what matters." Grace pushed the plate of butter closer to Alexandra. "Dad's pancakes are the best in town. Even Mrs. Henderson at the diner says so." A ghost of a smile touched Alexandra's lips. "Is that so?" "Gracie." Ethan chided gently, but couldn't hide his own small smile. He brought the stack of pancakes to the table, and they fell into the familiar routine of passing syrup and butter. Alexandra watched them, something wistful in her expression. "Please," she said after taking a few bites, "let me compensate you for your trouble. The room, the breakfast." "That's not necessary," Ethan cut in firmly. "I insist. I can write a check." "Miss Pierce," he said, his voice kind but leaving no room for argument, "we don't need payment for helping someone who needed it." Alexandra fell silent, studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away. But he held her gaze steadily, and after a moment, she nodded slightly. "Thank you," she said softly. Grace, who had been watching this exchange with interest, suddenly brightened. "Dad, can we show her the chickens before she goes? They just started laying again after taking forever off for winter." "I'm sure Ms. Pierce needs to get back to the city," Ethan began, but Alexandra surprised him by shaking her head. "I'd love to see them, if it's not an imposition," she said, and there was something almost vulnerable in her voice. They finished breakfast with less tension, Grace chattering about her favorite hen, a speckled Sussex named Penny. Alexandra listened attentively, asking questions that made Grace beam with pleasure. Ethan observed the interaction, noting how the steady rhythm of metal against metal echoed through Ethan's garage as he worked on old Mr. Peterson's tractor. Winter sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The familiar scent of motor oil and grease filled the air, mingling with the crisp January cold that seeped in despite the shop's heating. The bell above the door chimed, its cheerful tone cutting through the mechanical sounds. Ethan slid out from under the tractor, wiping his hands on a rag as he turned toward the entrance. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Alexandra Pierce standing in his shop. She looked different from the polished CEO he'd last seen, or the disheveled woman from 2 nights ago. Today, she wore dark jeans, practical winter boots, and a thick wool coat. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a brown paper bag that bore the gold-embossed logo of Marlowe's, the city's most exclusive bakery. "Mr. Cole," she said, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Just Ethan," he replied, tossing the rag onto his workbench. "And no, you're not interrupting. Everything okay?" Alexandra stepped further into the shop, her boots leaving small puddles of melted snow. "Yes, I wanted to thank you properly. For the other night." She held up the paper bag. "I brought pastries, and I was hoping to see Grace, if she's around." As if on cue, Grace's voice called out from the small office. "Dad? Who's here?" She appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up when she spotted Alexandra. "Miss Pierce!" Alexandra's professional facade softened visibly. "Hello, Grace. And please, call me Alexandra." "Are those from Marlowe's?" Grace asked, eyeing the bag with interest. "Their chocolate croissants are amazing. Mom used to bring them home sometimes as a special treat." A shadow of emotion crossed Ethan's face at the mention of his late wife, but it passed quickly. "Why don't we move this to the office? I could use a break anyway." The office was small but warm, with a beat-up desk and a couple of mismatched chairs. Pictures of Grace at various ages decorated one wall, along with her artwork and 4-H ribbons. Alexandra took in the personal touches, her expression thoughtful. Grace cleared a space on the desk while Ethan brought in an extra chair from the shop. Alexandra began unpacking the bag, revealing an assortment of perfectly crafted pastries that looked out of place in the humble surroundings. "I got a variety since I wasn't sure what everyone liked," she explained, arranging them on paper napkins. "The chocolate croissants, of course, but also some apple turnovers and these little lemon tarts." "They're beautiful," Grace said, selecting a croissant. "Almost too pretty to eat. Almost." She took a big bite, chocolate smearing the corner of her mouth. Ethan chose an apple turnover, noting how Alexandra seemed to relax as they ate. The formal businesswoman he'd seen in news photos was nowhere in sight. Instead, she listened intently as Grace chatted about her science project and the lamb she was raising for 4-H. "His name is Wooly," Grace explained, reaching for a lemon tart. "He's still little, but he's growing fast. You should come see him sometime. He loves visitors." "I'd like that," Alexandra said, and the sincerity in her voice surprised Ethan. "I've never been around farm animals much. The closest I get to nature these days is the office building's rooftop garden." "That sounds kind of lonely," Grace observed with a child's direct honesty. Alexandra's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, I suppose it is." The conversation drifted to lighter topics. Grace's upcoming school play, stories about some of Ethan's more unusual repair jobs, Alexandra's childhood memory of her grandfather's workshop. The tension that had initially filled the room gradually dissipated, replaced by something warmer and more comfortable. When the pastries were gone and the paper napkins crumpled, Alexandra glanced at her watch. "I should get going. I have a meeting in the city at 3. "Will you come visit again?" Grace asked, hope clear in her voice. Alexandra paused in the act of buttoning her coat. "I'd like that very much. If it's all right with your father?" Ethan nodded, surprising himself with how easily the gesture came. "You're welcome any time." They walked her to her car, a modest sedan rather than the luxury vehicle Ethan had expected. Alexandra turned at the driver's door, her breath visible in the cold air. The smile she gave them was genuine, reaching her eyes in a way that transformed her whole face. "Thank you for lunch," she said, "and for everything." "Thanks for the pastries," Grace replied, giving her an impulsive hug that seemed to startle Alexandra before she carefully returned it. Ethan and Grace stood in the doorway of the shop, watching as Alexandra's car disappeared down the snowy road. The warmth from their shared lunch lingered, and Ethan realized his shoulders felt looser, the perpetual weight he carried somehow lighter. He couldn't quite explain why. "I like her," Grace declared, heading back inside. "She seems different from how she looks on TV." Ethan remained in the doorway for a moment longer, watching the empty road where Alexandra's car had vanished. The winter air nipped at his cheeks, but he barely noticed it. Saturday morning arrived with a gentle dusting of snow, coating the farmhouse's wooden porch in a thin white blanket. The kitchen windows glowed warm and inviting against the pale winter sky. Inside, Grace sat at the worn oak table, her math homework spread before her as Ethan flipped pancakes on the griddle. The crunch of tires on gravel announced Alexandra's arrival. Grace bounded to the window, her face lighting up at the sight of the black SUV pulling into their driveway. "She's here, Dad!" Ethan glanced up from the stove, trying to ignore the slight flutter in his chest. Alexandra emerged from her car carrying a paper bag from the local bakery, her boots leaving neat prints in the fresh snow. Grace threw open the door before Alexandra could knock. "You came!" She grabbed Alexandra's free hand and pulled her inside. "I promised, didn't I?" Alexandra's smile was genuine, softening the sharp lines of her face. She held up the bag. "I brought cinnamon rolls from that little place in town." "Perfect timing," Ethan said, sliding the last pancake onto a platter. "Coffee's fresh, too." They settled around the table, passing plates and syrup. Alexandra watched with quiet amusement as Grace drowned her pancakes in maple syrup. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the silver threads in Alexandra's dark hair. "What are you working on?" Alexandra asked, noticing Grace's scattered papers. Grace wrinkled her nose. "Algebra. I hate word problems." "May I?" Alexandra set down her coffee cup and pulled the worksheet closer. "You know, these aren't so different from the problems I solve at work. It's all about breaking them down into smaller pieces." For the next hour, Alexandra guided Grace through each problem with unexpected patience. Ethan watched from the sink as he washed dishes, struck by how naturally Alexandra explained complex concepts in ways Grace could understand. His daughter's frustrated frown gradually transformed into focused concentration. "That's it," Alexandra praised as Grace solved the final equation. "See? You had it in you all along?" Grace beamed. "Can we go to the farmer's market now, Dad? I promised to show Alexandra the honey stand." The local farmer's market occupied the town square, a collection of wooden stalls and food trucks arranged around the old courthouse. Regular vendors recognized Grace, calling out friendly greetings as the trio walked past displays of winter vegetables and handmade crafts. Alexandra moved differently here, Ethan noticed. Gone was the rigid posture of a CEO. Her shoulders relaxed, and she smiled easily at the vendors, asking questions about their products with genuine interest. No one seemed to recognize her as the powerful executive from the city news. At Mrs. Wilson's knitting stall, Alexandra paused to run her fingers over a display of scarves. "These are beautiful," she said, lifting a soft blue one woven with silver threads. Grace touched the scarf reverently. "It matches your eyes," she told Alexandra. Before Ethan could reach for his wallet, Alexandra had already handed Mrs. Wilson some cash. "For my favorite math student," she said, wrapping the scarf around Grace's neck. "Oh, thank you." Grace threw her arms around Alexandra's waist in an impulsive hug. For a moment, Alexandra froze, clearly unused to such open affection. Then her arms slowly wrapped around Grace, her expression softening into something vulnerable and real. They wandered through the market, sampling fresh apple cider and watching a local musician play guitar. At the cookie stand, Alexandra bought a dozen still-warm chocolate chip cookies, laughing when Grace immediately claimed 2 for herself. "Save room for lunch," Ethan warned, but he was smiling too. The morning stretched into early afternoon. They shared hot chocolate from paper cups, their breath visible in the cold air as they talked about everything and nothing. Alexandra listened intently to Grace's stories about school and her plans for the spring garden, offering suggestions and encouragement. As the sun began its early winter descent, they walked back to the farmhouse. Grace skipped ahead, her new scarf trailing behind her like a banner. "Thank you for including me today," Alexandra said quietly to Ethan. "It's been nice, being just another person for a while." Ethan studied her profile, noting how the crisp air had brought color to her cheeks. "You're welcome here anytime," he found himself saying, meaning it more than he'd expected to. Standing in the driveway, Alexandra hesitated before leaving. Grace hugged her again, this time without hesitation. "Will you come back soon?" "I'd like that," Alexandra replied, her voice slightly husky. Ethan and Grace stood on the porch as Alexandra's SUV backed out of the driveway. Through the rear window, they could see her glance in the rearview mirror, her expression wistful. The vehicle disappeared around the bend, leaving only tire tracks in the snow. Grace leaned against her father's side, still wearing her new scarf. "I like her, Dad." Ethan wrapped an arm around his daughter's shoulders, aware of a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Their quiet life had shifted somehow, like the first thaw of spring, but he wasn't sure yet what would grow from this change. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows on a crisp Sunday morning. Ethan sat at the oak table, sipping his second cup of coffee while scanning the local paper. Grace munched on toast nearby, her feet swinging beneath her chair as she read a book. The TV droned quietly in the background, morning news mixing with the comfortable sounds of their weekend routine. Ethan flipped to the business section, and his hand froze mid-turn. There, in bold black letters across the top of the page, the headline struck him like a physical blow. "Alexandra Pierce, under investigation for corporate fraud." His coffee forgotten, Ethan leaned closer to read. The article detailed allegations of embezzlement and financial misconduct at Pierce Industries. The words "millions missing" and "criminal investigation" jumped out at him. Grace noticed his sudden stillness. "Dad, what's wrong?" She abandoned her book and peered over his shoulder. Her sharp intake of breath told him she'd seen the headline. That can't be right. Alexandra wouldn't do that. The TV news anchor's voice suddenly cut through their shock. "Breaking news in the Pierce Industries scandal." They both turned to watch as Alexandra's corporate headshot filled the screen, followed by footage of her walking into her office building, reporters swarming around her. Sources close to the investigation claim CEO Alexandra Pierce orchestrated a complex scheme to funnel company funds into offshore accounts, the anchor continued. The board of directors has called for. Alexandra followed Ethan up the familiar stairs to the spare bedroom, her designer overnight bag looking oddly out of place against the worn wooden floorboards. The room was exactly as she remembered it from that first night, though this time she was painfully sober and aware of every detail. The patchwork quilt on the bed, the simple wooden dresser, and the small window overlooking the snowy farmland. "I know it's not what you're used to," Ethan said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Alexandra shook her head, setting her bag down carefully. "It's perfect. I can't thank you enough for this." Grace appeared in the doorway, clutching a steaming mug of chamomile tea. "I made this for you," she said, padding across the room in her fuzzy socks. "Mom always said tea helps when you're worried about things." Alexandra's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the mug, touched by the young girl's thoughtfulness. "That's very sweet of you, Grace. Thank you." Ethan cleared his throat, and both females turned to look at him. He stood with his arms crossed, his expression serious but not stern. "We need to talk about how this is going to work," he said. "I'm willing to help you, Alexandra, but there have to be some rules." She nodded, perching on the edge of the bed. "Of course, whatever you say." "First, no unnecessary trips into town," he stated firmly. "The fewer people who see you here, the better. This is a small community, word travels fast." "I understand," Alexandra replied, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Second," Ethan continued, "and this is non-negotiable. No lying to me. If you're in real trouble, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. I won't have Grace put at risk." Alexandra met his gaze steadily. "I promise, Ethan. Everything I told you about being framed is true. I would never put either of you in danger." Grace moved to sit beside Alexandra on the bed. "I'll keep your secret," she declared solemnly. "Nobody at school will know you're here." A small smile touched Alexandra's lips. "Thank you, sweetheart." The next day brought a strange new rhythm to the farmhouse. Alexandra woke early, unused to the rooster's morning calls. She found Grace already dressed in her winter coat and boots, heading out to do the morning chores. "Want to help feed the chickens?" Grace asked brightly. Alexandra glanced down at her silk pajamas and bare feet. I'm not really dressed for farm work." "I have some old clothes you can borrow," Grace offered, disappearing into her room and returning with faded jeans and a warm flannel shirt. "They were Mom's, but Dad keeps them in my closet. They might fit you." Alexandra changed into the borrowed clothes, feeling oddly emotional about wearing the garments of Grace's deceased mother. The jeans were a little short, but the flannel shirt was warm and soft from years of washing. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean. Grace showed Alexandra how to scatter feed for the chickens, laughing when the birds crowded around their feet. "They're friendly once you get to know them," she explained, demonstrating how to check the nesting boxes for eggs. Later, they tackled the porch, sweeping away the previous night's snow. Alexandra found herself enjoying the simple physical work, so different from board meetings and spreadsheets. Her muscles ached pleasantly, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. When Ethan returned from the garage for lunch, he found them in the kitchen. Alexandra had helped Grace inventory the pantry, and together they'd managed to create a hearty soup from canned vegetables and dried herbs. "It's not gourmet," Alexandra apologized, ladling the soup into bowls, "but it's hot." Ethan took a spoonful and nodded approvingly. Sometimes the simplest meals are the best ones. As evening settled in, they gathered in the living room. Ethan built a fire while Grace and Alexandra played cards on the coffee table. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the wind whistled outside, making the warmth inside feel even more precious. Grace gradually migrated to the couch, where Alexandra sat reading a dog-eared paperback from the bookshelf. Without ceremony, the young girl laid her head in Alexandra's lap, continuing to read her own book. Alexandra froze for a moment, then tentatively began stroking Grace's hair the way she remembered her own mother doing when she was small. Ethan, settled in his armchair with the newspaper, watched them over the top of the pages. His expression was difficult to read, part wariness, part wonder. Here was Alexandra Pierce, the infamous CEO known for her cutthroat business tactics, gently running her fingers through his daughter's hair while Grace dozed peacefully. The fire crackled softly, and outside the window, snow began to fall again. Alexandra caught Ethan's gaze and held it for a moment, understanding passing between them. She knew he was still uncertain about trusting her, still worried about the consequences of harboring her. But in this quiet moment, with Grace sleeping trustingly in her lap and the fire warming them all, there was an undeniable sense of rightness that neither of them could ignore. The kitchen clock ticked softly, marking out midnight as Ethan padded down the creaking stairs. He'd heard movement below and wanted to check everything was okay. The habit of midnight checks had started after Sarah passed, making sure Grace was sleeping soundly, doors were locked, the house was safe. A dim light spilled from the kitchen. Alexandra sat at the worn oak table, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug. She'd borrowed one of his old flannel shirts to stay warm, and her hair fell loose around her shoulders. Without makeup and designer clothes, she looked younger, more vulnerable. "Couldn't sleep?" Ethan asked quietly, moving to fill the kettle. Alexandra startled slightly, then gave a wan smile. "I haven't had a good night's sleep in months, if I'm being honest." She took a sip of tea, her hands trembling slightly. "Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces, people I thought were friends, colleagues I trusted for years, all of them turning against me." Ethan settled into the chair across from her, studying her face in the soft light from above the stove. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and worry lines creased her forehead. "Must be hard, having your whole world turned upside down like that." "The worst part isn't even the accusations," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's the loneliness. 20 years building a company, and not one person stood by me when things got rough." She gave a bitter laugh. "Turns out success is a pretty lonely place to live." The kettle whistled, and Ethan rose to make his own tea. The familiar motions bag, hot water, honey gave him time to gather his thoughts. "I know something about loneliness," he said finally, returning to the table. "After Sarah, me wife, passed, it felt like the whole world had gone quiet." Alexandra's expression softened. "How long ago?" 5. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Alexandra stood at the stove, carefully flipping pancakes. Her designer clothes had been replaced by borrowed jeans and one of Ethan's old flannel shirts, rolled up at the sleeves. The transformation wasn't just in her appearance. Her shoulders had lost their rigid set, and genuine smiles came more easily now. "You're getting better at this," Grace said, watching as Alexandra managed to flip a pancake without breaking it. "They're almost as good as Dad's." Alexandra chuckled. "Almost being the key word. Your father's pancakes are legendary." She glanced over at Ethan, who was fixing the kitchen sink's leaky faucet. "Here," he said, emerging from under the sink. "Hold this wrench like this." He guided her hands, showing her how to tighten the pipe properly. The simple touch sent warmth through both of them, though neither acknowledged it. Grace watched the interaction with poorly hidden delight. "Can Alexandra help me with my science project today? She knows all about chemical reactions." "As long as we're careful about being seen," Ethan reminded them. The local news had run several stories about Alexandra's disappearance, though interest was starting to fade in their small town. They had created a cover story. Alexandra was Ethan's cousin Sarah, visiting from Oregon. The story seemed to satisfy most people's curiosity, especially since Alexandra had traded her power suits for casual clothes and pulled her hair back in a simple ponytail. After breakfast, Alexandra helped Grace with her project on the kitchen table. They mixed baking soda and vinegar, watching it fizz and bubble. Alexandra explained the reaction with patience and enthusiasm, her corporate persona completely forgotten. "You're really good at teaching," Grace said, scribbling notes in her notebook. "Way better than Mrs. Henderson at school." Alexandra felt a warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. "I used to help my little sister with her homework. Before." She trailed off, her expression clouding briefly. "Before what?" Grace asked. "Before life got complicated," Alexandra finished softly. She quickly changed the subject. "Should we head to the hardware store? Your dad mentioned needing some supplies for the barn door." They drove into town in Ethan's truck, Alexandra wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses as an extra precaution. The hardware store's bell jingled as they entered, and old Mr. Peterson greeted them warmly. "Sarah, good to see you again," he called out. "You're fitting right in here. Saw you at church last Sunday." Alexandra smiled, remembering how she'd nervously attended the service with Ethan and Grace, finding unexpected comfort in the simple ritual and friendly faces. "Everyone's been so welcoming," she replied. As they gathered supplies, Mrs. Thompson from the quilting circle stopped to chat. "You must join us for our Wednesday meeting," she insisted. "We could use some young blood, and Grace tells me you're quite handy with a needle." Alexandra had indeed been helping Grace mend her winter clothes, something she hadn't done since college. "I'd love to," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Back at the farmhouse, Alexandra helped Ethan fix the barn door. She held the hammer awkwardly at first, but under his patient guidance, she managed to drive in several nails successfully. "Never thought I'd see the day when Alexandra Pierce would be doing manual labor," Ethan teased gently. She wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a smudge of dirt. "Never thought I'd enjoy it either. But there's something satisfying about fixing things with your own hands." "Different from fixing companies?" he asked, his tone curious rather than judgmental. Alexandra paused, considering. "With companies, it was always about the bottom line. Here." She gestured to the repaired door. "Here, you can see exactly how your work helps others. It's real." That evening, they worked together in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner of chicken soup and homemade bread. Grace sat at the table, doing her homework, and occasionally joining their quiet conversation. The domesticity of it all struck Alexandra. How natural it felt to move around the kitchen with Ethan. How comfortable the silence was. After dinner, Grace convinced them to play a board game. Alexandra couldn't remember the last time she'd played Monopoly, but she found herself laughing as Grace proved to be a surprisingly shrewd property magnate. "You're a natural businesswoman," Alexandra told her, and Grace beamed with pride. When Grace went upstairs to bed, Alexandra stepped out onto the porch. The night air was crisp and clean, so different from the city's perpetual smog. Stars dotted the black velvet sky, visible here in a way they never were in the city. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, another call from her lawyer, probably with more bad news about the investigation. She let it go to voicemail, just as she had with the dozens of other calls from board members, reporters, and former colleagues. The screen lit up with notifications, missed calls, unread emails, news alerts about her case. Each one represented the life she'd left behind, the power, the pressure, the constant performance. She thought about her penthouse apartment, probably collecting dust now, and realized she didn't miss it at all. Here, in this small town, in this farmhouse with its creaky floors and warm kitchen, she'd found something she'd never had in her corporate life: peace. The simple rhythm of days, filled with actual work, genuine conversations, and real connections, had shown her a different way to live. Alexandra took a deep breath of the country air, tinged with the scent of hay and approaching rain. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't even look at it. Instead, she watched the fireflies dance in the darkness, their light reminding her of the stars above. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly present, truly herself. The screen door creaked behind her, and she knew without turning that it was Ethan. He joined her at the railing, their shoulders almost touching. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the night unfold around them, while her phone continued its urgent, ignored summons to her old life. The late morning sun cast long shadows through the farmhouse windows as Ethan sorted through the day's mail. Bills, advertisements, and a thick manila envelope that made him pause. It was addressed to Alexandra Pierce, care of his address. His stomach tightened. "Alexandra?" he called up the stairs. "There's something here for you." She appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing one of his old flannel shirts over her designer jeans. Her face paled when she saw the envelope in his hands. With trembling fingers, she took it from him and broke the seal. The kitchen fell silent as she pulled out a stack of documents. Her eyes darted back and forth across the pages, her breath becoming more shallow with each paragraph she read. Legal terms jumped out from the pages: malfeasance, criminal intent, breach of fiduciary duty. "I can't," Alexandra's voice cracked. The papers slipped from her hands, scattering across the floor like autumn leaves. Before Ethan could speak, she turned and fled through the back door. He found her in the barn 20 minutes later. She sat on a hay bale, surrounded by the musty scent of dried grass and old wood. Afternoon light filtered through the slats, drawing golden lines across her face. Her eyes were red, but dry. "They detailed everything," she said without looking up, "every accusation, every piece of evidence they manufactured." Her fingers twisted together in her lap. "Would you like to know the truth?" Ethan pulled up another hay bale and sat across from her. "Only if you want to tell me?" Alexandra took a deep breath. "I built that company from nothing. 15 years of my life, sacrificing everything: relationships, family, any chance at a normal life." She gave a bitter laugh. "I thought it was worth it because we were doing good work, creating jobs, developing sustainable technologies. What changed? 3 months ago, I discovered some of my board members were pushing through contracts with shell companies they owned. Kickbacks, inflated costs, the whole scheme." She stood up, pacing between the wooden support beams. "I threatened to expose them. They moved first. Ethan watched her move, noticed how her shoulders hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. They framed you. They were thorough. Alexandra stopped at a shaft of sunlight, dust motes dancing around her. They doctored financial records, backdated documents, paid off witnesses, made it look like I'd been embezzling for years. Her voice cracked again. The worst part? Some of these people I thought they were my friends. People can surprise you, Ethan said quietly. Sometimes in good ways, sometimes not. Alexandra turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. Why did you help me that night? You didn't know me. I could have been dangerous. Because you needed help, he said simply. And sometimes that's reason enough. She sank back down onto the hay bale, closer to him this time. I keep thinking about all the decisions I made, the people I stepped on climbing to the top. Maybe this is karma. That's not how karma works, Ethan said. And it's not how justice works either. If you're innocent, we'll find a way to prove it. We? Alexandra's voice was small, uncertain. Grace already considers you family, he said with a slight smile. And he paused, choosing his words carefully. I believe you, about the frame-up. How can you be so sure? Because I've watched you these past weeks. With Grace, with the neighbors, even with those chickens you've somehow charmed. He leaned forward, his voice earnest. The woman I see isn't capable of what they're accusing you of. Alexandra's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to do. Everything I built, everything I worked for, it's all falling apart. Then we'll face it together, Ethan said firmly. One day at a time, just like everything else. The barn fell quiet except for the soft cooing of pigeons in the rafters. Alexandra wiped her eyes with the sleeve of his borrowed shirt. I never thought I'd find refuge in a place like this, with people like you and Grace. Life has a way of leading us where we need to be, Ethan said, standing up. He held out his hand to her, even if it's not where we planned. Alexandra took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. What if they find me here? I don't want to bring trouble to you and Grace. We'll get through it, Ethan assured her, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that flickered in his eyes. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. The early December morning brought a crisp chill to the farmhouse. Alexandra sat cross-legged on her bed, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in hushed tones. Yes, that's right. I need absolute discretion on this project, she whispered, glancing at her closed bedroom door. The funds will be transferred today. Just make sure everything's ready by Christmas Eve. She ended the call and tucked the phone into her pocket, her heart racing slightly at the secrecy of it all. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her quickly shuffle some papers under her pillow. Grace poked her head in, her bright eyes curious. Alexandra? Dad says breakfast is ready. She lingered in the doorway, fidgeting with her sleeve. Were you on the phone again? Alexandra managed a casual smile. Just taking care of some business, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about. Later that morning, Alexandra slipped on her boots and made her way to the barn. The old structure provided perfect privacy for her calls, the thick wooden walls muffling her voice. She dialed another number, pacing between stacks of hay bales. Mike? Yes. About the permits will need them expedited. She paused, listening. Double the fee if necessary. I want no delays. From the farmhouse window, Grace watched Alexandra's figure moving back and forth in the barn. She turned to her father, who was washing dishes at the sink. Dad, Alexandra's been going to the barn a lot lately. Do you think something's wrong? Ethan dried his hands on a dish towel, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes grown-ups need space to handle their problems, Grace. We need to respect that. That afternoon, the mood lightened as they gathered around a fresh-cut pine tree in the living room. Grace pulled out boxes of ornaments, each one wrapped carefully in tissue paper. These were Mom's favorites, she explained to Alexandra, holding up a delicate glass angel. Alexandra handled each ornament with reverence, recognizing the weight of being included in this family tradition. Tell me about this one, she said, pointing to a handmade decoration clearly crafted by younger hands. Grace beamed. I made that in first grade. It's supposed to be a reindeer, but I guess it looks more like a potato with legs." Their laughter filled the room as they continued decorating. Alexandra found herself sharing stories of her own childhood Christmas impulse celebrations with homemade decorations and her grandmother's cookies. "We didn't have much," she admitted, "but somehow it always felt magical." Ethan worked quietly on the other side of the tree, stealing glances at Alexandra and Grace. He noticed how Alexandra's usual sharp edges had softened, how naturally she fit into their home despite her secrets. When she caught him looking, he quickly busied himself with untangling lights. Between hanging ornaments, Alexandra made excuses to check her phone, responding to texts from contractors and her trusted attorney. Each message brought her plan closer to fruition. Grace noticed these moments too, but instead of questioning them, she would simply hand Alexandra another ornament, pulling her back into their peaceful afternoon. As dusk approached, Alexandra received a final confirmation. The permits were approved, the workers were scheduled, and everything was in motion. She retreated to the barn one last time, this time carrying a manila envelope filled with carefully prepared documents. The barn's interior was cool and dim, smelling of hay and old wood. Alexandra ran her fingers along the papers inside the envelope, double-checking every detail. Satisfaction spread across her face as she tucked the envelope into her coat. Back in her room, she slipped the envelope into her suitcase, buried beneath sweaters and scarves. A small smile played at her lips as she thought about Christmas Eve, now just days away. Through the window, she could hear Grace and Ethan's voices as they finished stringing lights outside, their warmth and acceptance making her more certain than ever about her decision. She joined them outside, helping to untangle the last strand of lights. The setting sun painted the snow in shades of pink and gold, and for a moment Alexandra forgot about her secret plans, lost in the simple joy of belonging. That evening, as they sat around the fireplace admiring their decorated tree, Grace leaned against Alexandra's shoulder. "This is the best tree we've had since Mom," she said softly. "I think she would have liked having you here." Alexandra swallowed hard, her hand finding Grace's. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with another message about tomorrow's arrangements, but for now, she let it wait. Some moments were too precious to interrupt. The farmhouse kitchen glowed with warmth as savory aromas filled the air. Alexandra had insisted on cooking dinner, and now the scent of roasted chicken and herbs mingled with the pine fragrance from their decorated Christmas tree. Grace set the table while Ethan stoked the fire in the living room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "This smells amazing," Ethan said as Alexandra pulled fresh rolls from the oven. She'd tied an apron over her sweater, and a light dusting of flour touched her cheek. The sight made something twist in his chest. During dinner, Alexandra seemed distracted, checking her phone more than usual. Grace chatted about school and her upcoming holiday break, filling the comfortable silence between the adults. When they finished eating, Alexandra straightened in her chair. "I have something to show you both," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous energy radiating from her. She retrieved a large manila envelope from her room and returned to the table. Grace leaned forward, curiosity bright in her eyes. "Is this why you've been making all those secret phone calls?" Alexandra smiled, laying out several documents and architectural drawings. "Yes, it is. Ethan, do you remember telling me about Sarah's work at the community center?" Ethan's expression softened at the mention of his late wife. "She taught art classes there for years. The kids loved her." "The building's been falling apart since they lost funding," Alexandra continued. She spread out before and after renderings, showing a beautifully restored Victorian building. "I've arranged for a complete renovation, new heating system, repairs to the roof, updated classrooms, and a proper art studio." Grace gasped, pointing to the drawings. "Look, Dad, they're going to fix the playground too." Ethan stared at the plans, his throat tight. "Alexandra, this must have cost." She touched his hand lightly. "Don't worry about that. What matters is that Sarah's work will continue. The Sarah Cole Memorial Community Center will serve this town for generations to come." Grace bounced in her seat. "Can we go see it? When will it be finished?" "Construction starts next week," Alexandra said. "It should be ready by spring." She pulled out more papers, permits, contracts, and letters of support from town council members. "Everything's arranged. The town has agreed to maintain it once the renovation is complete." Ethan remained silent, studying the drawings with intense focus. His fingers traced the outline of the building where Sarah had spent so many happy hours teaching children to paint and draw. Alexandra watched him, uncertainty creeping into her expression. "If you don't want this," she began. "No," he said quickly, his voice rough with emotion. "No, it's perfect. Sarah would have loved this. He cleared his throat. "Thank you. Doesn't seem enough." Grace yawned, the excitement of the evening catching up with her. "Can I go read in my room?" "Of course, sweetheart," Ethan said. "Don't stay up too late." After Grace disappeared upstairs, Alexandra and Ethan moved to the living room. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over them as they sat on the couch. The Christmas tree lights twinkled in the corner, and outside, snow began to fall. "I know what it's like to lose something precious," Alexandra said quietly. "But Sarah's legacy deserves to live on. The children in this town deserve a place to dream and create, just like she believed." Ethan turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You've changed since that night I found you in my truck." She laughed softly. "Being here, with you and Grace, it's helped me remember who I used to be, before the corporate world hardened me." Their eyes met, and the air seemed to grow thick with unspoken words. Alexandra's hand rested on the couch between them, and Ethan's fingers inched closer until they barely touched. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. "Alexandra," he whispered, leaning slightly closer. She tilted her face toward his, her breath catching. The distance between them shrank to inches, then centimeters. The warmth of the fire wrapped around them like a cocoon, and for a moment, the world beyond the farmhouse ceased to exist. But then, Grace's bedroom door creaked upstairs, and they both pulled back slightly. Alexandra's cheeks flushed, and Ethan ran a hand through his hair. The moment hung between them, fragile as a soap bubble, full of possibility and uncertainty. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire dance. Though they hadn't kissed, something had shifted between them. A door had opened that couldn't quite be closed again. But neither made another move, both acutely aware of the complications that lay ahead. Alexandra's legal troubles, Ethan's cautious nature, and the delicate balance of their current arrangement. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed softly, marking the late hour. Above them, Grace's light clicked off, and the house settled into nighttime quiet, save for the gentle crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of falling snow against the windows. Morning sunlight filtered through the frost-etched windows of the farmhouse, casting diamond-like patterns across the living room floor. The Christmas tree twinkled with white lights, and wrapped presents sat in neat piles beneath its branches. The warm scent of cinnamon and coffee wafted from the kitchen where Ethan worked at the stove, flipping pancakes and humming Silent Night under his breath. Alexandra sat cross-legged on the floor next to Grace, both still in their pajamas. Grace's hair was sleep-tousled, and her eyes sparkled with excitement as she held up a carefully wrapped package. "This one's from me," Grace announced proudly, pressing it into Alexandra's hands. "I saved up my allowance." Alexandra's fingers trembled slightly as she accepted the gift. She couldn't remember the last time someone had given her a Christmas present that wasn't from a corporate client or board member. "You didn't have to get me anything, sweetheart." "Of course I did. Your family now." Grace's words hung in the air, simple and sincere. Alexandra carefully undid the wrapping paper, revealing a handmade photo frame decorated with pressed wildflowers. Inside was a picture Grace had taken of the three of them at the farmer's market, all laughing over hot chocolate. "Oh, Grace," Alexandra's voice caught. She pulled the girl into a tight hug, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. Ethan watched from the kitchen doorway, spatula in hand, a soft smile playing at his lips. The scene before him felt right in a way he couldn't explain. Grace bounced up and down. "Open the other one! The blue one is from Dad!" Before Alexandra could reach for it, 3 sharp knocks echoed through the house. The sound was official, commanding, nothing like the friendly taps of neighbors bringing Christmas cookies. Ethan set down his spatula and moved toward the front door. Through the frosted glass he could make out the dark shapes of uniforms. His stomach dropped. "Police! Open up!" Alexandra went still, her face draining of color. Grace clutched her arm, eyes wide with sudden fear. Ethan opened the door to find 2 officers on his porch, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Behind them, 2 police cruisers sat in his driveway, lights flashing silently against the snow. "Mr. Cole?" the first officer asked, his expression grim. "We have reason to believe Alexandra Pierce is on your property." Before Ethan could respond, Alexandra appeared beside him. She stood straight-backed, chin high, though her hands shook slightly at her sides. "I'm Alexandra Pierce." "Ms. Pierce, we have a warrant for your arrest." The officer pulled out his handcuffs while his partner began reading her rights. "You're charged with securities fraud, embezzlement, and corporate theft." "This is ridiculous," Alexandra's voice cracked. "I'm innocent. Everything you're accusing me of, it was orchestrated by my own board." Grace darted forward, wrapping her arms around Alexandra's waist. "You can't take her. She didn't do anything wrong." "Grace, honey." Alexandra's composure crumbled as she looked down at the crying girl. She wanted to hug her back, but the officer was already pulling her arms behind her. "Please," Grace sobbed. "It's Christmas morning. She was going to help me bake cookies for the neighbors." Ethan gently pulled Grace away as the handcuffs clicked into place. His daughter buried her face in his sweater, her small shoulders shaking. "Mr. Cole," the second officer said, "we'll need to ask you some questions about harboring a fugitive." Alexandra's eyes met Ethan's over Grace's head. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to bring this to your door." The officers led Alexandra down the porch steps. Snow had started falling again, fat flakes catching in her dark hair. She looked small between the uniformed men, still wearing her Christmas morning pajamas with little snowflakes printed on them, a gift Grace had given her the night before. Grace turned in Ethan's arms, reaching out one hand. "Alexandra." Alexandra looked back, tears now flowing freely down her face. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. I promise." The officers helped her into the back of the cruiser. Through the window, she pressed her cuffed hand against the glass. A final goodbye before the car pulled away. Ethan stood in the doorway, holding his sobbing daughter, as the police cruiser disappeared down the snowy road. The Christmas tree lights still twinkled behind them, and somewhere in the kitchen, pancakes were burning on the forgotten griddle. Silent snow continued to fall, erasing the tire tracks that led away from their home, taking Alexandra with them. The farmhouse kitchen felt hollow without Alexandra's morning chatter. No delicate clink of her coffee cup against the saucer, no gentle laughter at Grace's stories about school. Even the sunlight streaming through the windows seemed dimmer, as if the house itself missed her presence. Ethan stood at the sink, methodically washing breakfast dishes, while Grace pushed scrambled eggs around her plate. The phone rang for the 5th time that morning. They both knew what it meant. Another reporter trying to get the scoop on Alexandra Pierce's hideout. "Should we answer it?" Grace asked, her voice small and uncertain. "No, sweetheart." Ethan dried his hands on a dish towel. "Let it ring." The answering machine clicked on, and a woman's crisp voice filled the kitchen. "This is Sandra Martinez from Channel 7 News. We're hoping to speak with Ethan Cole regarding his connection to Alexandra Pierce." Grace stabbed at her eggs. "They're wrong about her dad. You know they are." Ethan's shoulders tensed. He'd been dodging this conversation for days, but Grace wouldn't let it go. "We don't know what to think yet, Grace." "Yes, we do." Grace pushed her plate away. "She helped us with the community center. She baked cookies with me. Bad people don't do stuff like that." "Sometimes." Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people can do nice things and still make bad choices in other areas of their life." "But she said she was innocent," Grace's voice cracked. "She told us the truth about everything." "Did she?" The question haunted Ethan. He remembered Alexandra's tears in the kitchen that night, her whispered confessions about loneliness and betrayal. Had it all been an act? The business papers called her the Ice Queen, ruthless, calculating, willing to do anything for power. The phone rang again. Ethan unplugged it, with more force than necessary. "I need to check on the garage," he said, grabbing his coat. "Stay inside, okay? Don't answer the door or the phone." The drive into town felt longer than usual. Ethan took the back roads, avoiding Main Street where he knew reporters might be lurking. As he approached the garage, he spotted a news van parked across the street. A woman with a microphone stood near his shop's entrance. Ethan drove past without stopping. He couldn't face their questions when he had so many of his own. His cell phone buzzed. A text from his sister. "Saw the news. You okay? Call me." He switched the phone off and turned down a dirt road that led to nowhere in particular. The frozen countryside stretched out around him, bare trees reaching toward a steel-gray sky. He thought about Alexandra's first morning in their kitchen, how different she'd looked from her polished CEO photos, vulnerable, genuine, grateful for simple kindness. When he finally returned home, Grace sat at the kitchen table surrounded by newspaper clippings about Alexandra. "Look, Dad," she said, pointing to an article. "It says the board members who accused her were already under investigation for other stuff. They're probably the real bad guys." "Grace." Ethan's throat felt tight. "We can't jump to conclusions." "But you liked her too." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I saw how you looked at her. You trusted her." The truth in his daughter's words stung. He had started to trust Alexandra, to see beyond the headlines to the woman who helped Grace with math homework and learned to feed chickens in designer boots. "I did trust her," he admitted quietly. "That's what makes this so hard." Grace wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "Then why can't you trust her now?" Ethan had no answer. Instead, he walked to Alexandra's room, the guest room, he corrected himself, and stood in the doorway. Her scent still lingered, something expensive and subtle. A forgotten hair tie lay on the nightstand. The bed was neatly made, corners tucked in military precise, just as she'd done every morning. On the desk sat the manila envelope containing the community center plans. Ethan picked it up, hands heavy with memory. Inside were detailed drawings, contractor estimates, and a handwritten note about dedicating the building to Sarah's memory. The paperwork looked legitimate, the funding already arranged through anonymous donors. He spread the papers across the desk, studying them for any sign of deception. But all he found was careful planning and thoughtful details. A children's reading room, a veterans support center, meeting spaces for local groups. Everything the town needed, everything Sarah would have loved. Grace appeared in the doorway. Mom would have really liked her, wouldn't she? Ethan's chest tightened. "Yeah, I think she would have." "Then shouldn't we believe in her like Mom would have?" Ethan stared at the community center plans, at Alexandra's elegant handwriting in the margins. The project could have been a masterful cover story, a way to gain their trust and hide from the law. Or it could be exactly what it seemed. A genuine gesture of gratitude and caring from a woman who'd found something real in their simple life. He gathered the papers carefully, unable to dismiss either possibility. The truth hung somewhere between trust and doubt, between the Alexandra they'd known and the one splashed across news headlines. The morning fog clung to the city skyline as Ethan's truck rumbled through downtown. He felt out of place among the gleaming office buildings and well-dressed professionals hurrying along the sidewalks. His worn work jacket and muddy boots marked him as an outsider, but he didn't care. He had to know the truth. Alexandra's lawyer's office occupied the 10th floor of a glass and steel building. The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area with leather chairs and abstract art. A slim woman in a charcoal suit looked up from her desk. "I'm here to see Mr. Harrison," Ethan said, clearing his throat. "About Alexandra Pierce's case." The receptionist's professional smile wavered. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but—" Ethan straightened his shoulders. "Tell him Ethan Cole is here. Alexandra stayed at my house." Minutes later, James Harrison emerged. younger than Ethan expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He ushered Ethan into his office, closing the door. "Miss Pierce mentioned you might come," Harrison said, gesturing to a chair. "She was quite adamant we speak with you if you reached out." Ethan sat, his hands clasped tightly. "I need to know if she was telling the truth about being framed." Harrison pulled out a thick file. "What I'm about to share is confidential." He spread several documents across his desk. "We've uncovered a pattern of suspicious transfers and altered records, all pointing to board members Thomas Reynolds and Marcus Chen." Ethan leaned forward, studying bank statements and email printouts. The technical details meant little to him, but the dates stood out. "These transactions, they're from when Alexandra was out of the country at a conference." "Exactly." Harrison nodded approvingly. "Someone used her passwords and authentication codes while she was demonstrably elsewhere. We've also found evidence of deleted security footage from the executive floor during key dates." "They set her up." The words came out as a whisper. "It appears so. Reynolds and Chen wanted control of the company. They knew Alexandra's reputation for being difficult would make her an easy target." Harrison straightened his papers. "The evidence is mounting. We're preparing to present it to the DA next week." Ethan's mind raced back to late-night conversations in his kitchen, Alexandra's voice breaking as she insisted on her innocence. The way she'd helped Grace with homework, pitched in with farm chores, worked to restore the community center, actions that spoke louder than any corporate document. "What can I do?" he asked. "Character witness statements would help. From you and others in your community who interacted with her. Show she's not the heartless corporate raider the media portrays." Ethan nodded, already thinking of neighbors who'd met Ethan's cousin during her stay. "I'll get them." The drive home felt shorter, purpose replacing uncertainty. Grace was waiting on the porch, homework spread across the swing, her face hopeful as he parked. "Did you see her?" she asked as he climbed the steps. "No, honey." Ethan sat beside her, the swing creaking gently. "But I talked to her lawyer. Remember how Alexandra said someone was trying to hurt her?" Grace nodded, clutching her pencil. "She was telling the truth. They found proof. Lots of it. Bad people at her company tried to make it look like she did wrong things, but she didn't." "I knew it." Grace's eyes lit up. "Can we help her?" Ethan pulled his daughter close. "We already are. By believing in her when others didn't. And we'll keep supporting her until everyone knows the truth." Grace scrambled up. "I want to write her a letter. Can I? I think she'd like that very much." While Ethan made dinner, Grace sat at the kitchen table, erasing and rewriting carefully. Her tongue poked out in concentration as she folded the paper into precise thirds. "Dear Alexandra, Dad went to see your lawyer today. He told me you were right all along. Those mean people tried to trick everyone, but they didn't trick us. We knew you were good. I miss our reading time and making cookies together. The kitchen feels empty without you. Even Dad seems sadder, though he tries to hide it. I'm keeping your secret cookie recipe safe. And when you come back, we'll make a huge batch to celebrate. Maybe we can deliver some to the community center you helped fix. Please, don't feel alone. Dad and I are here for you, and we're not going anywhere. We'll wait as long as it takes for the truth to come out. Love, Grace. P.S. I'm taking good care of the scarf you got me at the farmer's market. It still smells like your perfume." Grace held up the letter. "Can we mail it tomorrow?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He watched his daughter carefully address the envelope to Alexandra's lawyer's office, adding a small heart next to the return address. The kitchen timer chimed, but neither moved. They sat in comfortable silence, united in their belief in Alexandra, while outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The February sun cast long shadows across the community center's snow-covered lawn. Ethan stood with his hands in his pockets, watching as workers carried lumber and supplies through the old building's front doors. The once neglected structure was slowly coming back to life, just as Alexandra had planned. Grace bounced on her toes beside him, her breath visible in the cold air. "Look, Dad, they're starting to put up the new windows." She pointed to where two men carefully removed The courthouse steps gleamed with melting snow in the late morning light. Ethan shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his stomach tight with anticipation. Grace clutched his hand, her mittened fingers squeezing rhythmically as they waited. The stone building loomed above them, its windows reflecting the weak winter sun. "How much longer?" Grace asked for the third time, her breath forming little clouds in the crisp air. "Soon, honey." Ethan checked his watch again. The hearing had started 2 hours ago, and Alexandra's lawyer had promised to text when things were wrapping up. A few reporters lingered nearby, their cameras ready. They'd been camped outside the courthouse all morning, but Ethan had managed to keep Grace away from their questions. Now, as the moment drew closer, the journalists perked up, adjusting their equipment. Grace bounced on her toes, trying to stay warm. She'd insisted on wearing her best sweater, the blue one Alexandra had helped her pick out at the farmer's market months ago. Her handmade sign reading, "We believe in you," was starting to crumple from her nervous grip. Ethan's phone buzzed. One word from the lawyer, "Coming." "They're on their way out," he told Grace, whose face lit up instantly. The heavy courthouse doors groaned open. First came the lawyers, their briefcases clutched tight, faces professionally neutral. Then Alexandra appeared in the doorway, blinking in the bright light. She wore a simple gray suit, her hair pulled back neatly, but it was her expression that caught Ethan's breath, pure relief mixed with lingering disbelief. "Alexandra!" Grace broke free from Ethan's grasp and bounded up the steps. Alexandra's composure cracked at the sight of her. She dropped to her knees, not caring about the wet stone beneath her, and wrapped her arms around Grace. The girl's sign fluttered to the ground as they embraced. "I missed you so much," Alexandra whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She pressed her face into Grace's hair, shoulders shaking slightly. The cameras clicked rapidly, but Ethan barely noticed. He climbed the steps slowly, taking in the sight of them together again. When Alexandra finally looked up at him, her eyes were brimming with tears. "It's over," she said simply. "They found the evidence. The board members, they're the ones being arrested now." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "We never doubted you." Alexandra stood, keeping one arm around Grace. "I know. That meant everything." She wiped at her eyes with her free hand. "I don't think I would have made it through without knowing you both believed in me." The reporters began shouting questions, pushing closer. Alexandra's lawyer stepped in, raising his hands. "Ms. Pierce has been fully exonerated. All charges have been dropped. The real perpetrators are in custody. That's all we're saying today." Ethan moved protectively to Alexandra's side. "My truck's just around the corner," he said quietly. She nodded gratefully. Together, they made their way down the steps, Grace between them. The girl had retrieved her sign and was waving it triumphantly at the cameras. "Will you return to your position as CEO?" one reporter called out. Alexandra paused briefly. "No," she said firmly. "I have more important things to focus on now." She squeezed Grace's shoulder and shared a meaningful look with Ethan. They walked the short block to where Ethan had parked his truck. The familiar vehicle looked out of place among the sleek city cars, but Alexandra's face softened at the sight of it. This was the truck that had first brought her to safety on that snowy night that felt so long ago. Grace climbed into the middle seat, still beaming. Alexandra slid in next to her, while Ethan took the driver's side. The door creaked shut, sealing them in blessed quiet. For a moment, none of them spoke. The relief was too big, too fresh to put into words. Alexandra leaned her head back against the seat, eyes closed. Grace snuggled against her side. Outside, the winter clouds began to part, letting streams of sunlight paint the dashboard in warm strips. Ethan started the engine, its familiar rumble filling the cab. As they pulled away from the courthouse, Alexandra reached across Grace to squeeze his hand briefly. Her fingers were warm and steady, so different from the trembling woman he'd found in his back seat months ago. They drove through the city streets in comfortable silence, heading for the highway that would take them home. The sun broke through completely now, turning the dirty snowbanks into fields of diamonds. Alexandra watched the city recede in the side mirror, her expression peaceful for the first time in months. Grace dozed off against Alexandra's shoulder, still clutching her sign. Alexandra carefully smoothed the girl's hair, her movements gentle and maternal. Ethan caught her eye in the rearview mirror, and they shared a smile that held volumes of unspoken understanding. The highway stretched before them, leading back to the farmhouse where their unlikely story had begun. Ethan merged onto it smoothly, leaving the towers of the city behind. The winter sun streamed through the windshield, warm and promising, as they headed home together. The farmhouse kitchen glowed with late-afternoon sunlight as Alexandra sat at the worn wooden table, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. She'd changed out of her courtroom attire into borrowed clothes sewn of Ethan's old flannel shirts and a pair of Grace's sweatpants that just barely fit. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, and without makeup she looked younger, more vulnerable. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Alexandra said, looking down into her coffee. "About what matters. About who I want to be." Ethan leaned against the counter, his own mug warming his hands. Grace sat cross-legged in her usual chair, hanging on every word. "The board offered me my position back," Alexandra continued. "Full reinstatement as CEO, plus damages for the false accusations." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "They're terrified of a lawsuit." "That's great news," Grace exclaimed, but her smile faded when she saw Alexandra's expression. "I turned them down." Alexandra's voice was quiet but firm. "I'm resigning." Ethan straightened, surprised. "You're giving up your company?" "I'm choosing something different." Alexandra's eyes met his, clear and determined. "All those weeks here, watching you help people in the shop, seeing how this community takes care of each other, it changed me. Made me remember who I used to be, before the corporate world hardened me." She pulled a folder from her bag and spread several papers across the table. "I'm starting a foundation. Using my settlement money and most of my savings to help rural families and veterans." Her fingers traced the preliminary plans. "Small business grants, emergency assistance, job training programs, the kind of help that could have saved my father's farm when I was a kid." Grace scooted her chair closer, examining the papers with interest. "Like how you helped with the community center." "Exactly." Alexandra smiled. "That project showed me what's possible. How a little support at the right moment can change everything for a family or a whole town." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down, studying the plans. The scope was impressive: multiple states, partnerships with local organizations, direct assistance programs. "This is quite a change from running Pierce Industries." "I know it seems crazy," Alexandra admitted. "Trading boardrooms for small-town community centers, but for the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing something real, something that matters." "It's not crazy at all," Ethan said softly. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're good at seeing what people need, at finding solutions. Those skills don't have to be used for corporate takeovers." Grace bounced in her seat. "Can I help? Maybe with the website or social media stuff? Mrs. Peterson says I'm really good at digital design." Alexandra laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I'd love that. In fact," she pulled out another sheet of paper, "I was hoping to base the foundation here in town. The old Wilson building on Main Street is for sale. It would be perfect for offices, and there's space for community programs too." "Here?" Ethan's eyebrows rose. "Not in the city?" "The whole point is to be close to the communities we're serving," Alexandra explained. "Besides..." She glanced around the kitchen at the familiar walls that had sheltered her during her darkest days. "This place feels more like home than my penthouse ever did." Grace jumped up and hugged Alexandra tightly. "Does this mean you're staying?" "If that's okay with everyone," Alexandra said, looking at Ethan. He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "More than okay. We've got a spare room that's already got your name on it." They spent the rest of the evening planning. Grace brought out her laptop, already sketching logo designs. Ethan made his famous chili, the aroma filling the house as they talked through ideas. Alexandra's eyes shone with excitement as she described her vision, so different from the broken woman who'd first appeared in Ethan's truck on that snowy night. As darkness fell, They moved to the living room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Grace eventually dozed off on the couch, her laptop still open to foundation designs. "You're really sure about this?" Ethan asked quietly, watching Alexandra tuck a blanket around Grace. "More sure than I've been about anything in years," she replied. "When I was in jail, I had a lot of time to think. About power, success, what they really mean." She settled back into her chair. "I spent so long chasing things that left me empty. But here," she gestured to the room, to Grace's sleeping form, to him. "Here I found something real." Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames. There was no tension now, no secrets hanging between them. Just peace, and the promise of something new beginning. Later, as Alexandra climbed the stairs to the spare room, her room, she felt none of the fear or uncertainty that had haunted her previous stays. The farmhouse creaked its familiar welcome, and through her window she could see the stars scattered across the clear country sky. She was home. The community center hummed with activity as volunteers streamed in and out, carrying paint cans, lumber, and tools. Alexandra stood in the middle of what would become the main gathering space, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail, wearing old jeans spotted with paint. She studied the blueprints spread across a folding table, making notes with a pencil tucked behind her ear. "The contractor says we can start on the kitchen next week," she called out to Ethan, who was measuring a section of wall for new shelving. Her corporate precision hadn't disappeared, it had just found a new purpose in organizing renovation schedules and volunteer shifts. "Mrs. Henderson from the diner wants to teach cooking classes once it's ready." Grace piped up from her perch on a stepladder, where she was carefully painting trim. "She says everyone should know how to make a proper chicken pot pie." Ethan smiled, watching Alexandra walk the space with the same confidence she'd once commanded boardrooms. But now, instead of closing factories, she was helping build something. The transformation in her was remarkable. "The Veterans Support Group needs a meeting space," Alexandra said, consulting her notes. "We could convert that back room into something more private." She gestured toward a smaller area off the main hall. "Maybe add some comfortable chairs, better lighting." "Tom at the hardware store mentioned he'd donate materials," Ethan added, moving to stand beside her. Their shoulders brushed as they looked at the plans together. "His son just got back from overseas. Says having a place like this would have helped him a lot." Local volunteers filtered in throughout the afternoon. Miss Ruby from the quilting circle brought sandwiches for everyone. The high school woodshop teacher offered to build custom bookcases. Alexandra listened to each suggestion, treating their ideas with the same respect she'd once given to million-dollar proposals. Grace watched from her ladder as her father and Alexandra worked seamlessly together. When Alexandra struggled with a stubborn paint can lid, Ethan was there with the opener. When he needed an extra set of hands to hold a beam in place, she stepped in without being asked. They moved around each other like they'd been doing this for years. "The acoustic tiles arrived for the music room," Alexandra announced, checking her phone. "The choir director's excited about having proper rehearsal space. And the teens will have somewhere to practice that isn't someone's garage," Grace added, thinking of her friend's band. As the afternoon wore on, volunteers began heading home. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, and the empty space took on a peaceful quiet. Grace sat on the floor, sorting through paint swatches for the children's reading nook. Alexandra walked the perimeter, making final notes for the day. String lights that someone had hung earlier twinkled softly overhead, creating a warm glow. She paused by the old radio someone had brought in, turning it on low. Soft music filled the space. Ethan approached her, wiping his hands on a rag. "You've done amazing work here," he said quietly. "This place was just an empty building a few weeks ago. Now it's coming alive again." Alexandra turned to face him, her expression soft in the dim light. "I had help," she replied. "This whole town pitched in." "Because you showed them it was possible," he said. "You didn't just throw money at it, you got your hands dirty. People respect that." The music changed to something slower, more melodic. Without speaking, Ethan held out his hand. Alexandra hesitated for just a moment before taking it. He drew her close, and they began to sway gently to the music. Their dancing was simple, nothing fancy, just two people finding their rhythm together in a quiet moment. The fairy lights twinkled overhead like stars, casting soft shadows on the walls around them. Grace pretended to be very interested in her paint swatches, but she couldn't help sneaking glances at them. She'd never seen her father look so at peace since her mother died. And Alexandra's sharp edges that had defined her when they first met had softened into something warmer, more real. They moved together in the gentle light, neither speaking, letting the music fill the comfortable silence between them. Alexandra's head rested lightly on Ethan's shoulder, his hand steady at the small of her back. The rest of the world seemed to fade away, leaving just this moment, just this dance. The wooden floors creaked softly beneath their feet as they turned slowly in place. Through the windows, the last rays of sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, a perfect backdrop to this quiet scene in a small-town community center that was slowly becoming something more than just a building. It was becoming a symbol of new beginnings. The first hints of spring touched the farmhouse as winter slowly released its grip. Patches of grass peeked through melting snow, and morning birdsong returned to fill the crisp air. Alexandra's sleek car sat in the driveway, packed with carefully chosen belongings from her city life. Ethan carried a box marked books up the creaky stairs to the spare room, though it hadn't felt like a spare room for months now. Alexandra followed with an armload of hanging clothes, her designer suits looking oddly out of place against the room's simple furnishings. "I can't believe how much stuff I thought I needed," she said, shaking her head as she hung the clothes in the closet. "Half of these I never even wore." Grace bounced on the bed, watching them unpack. "Can I have this one?" she asked, holding up a silk scarf in shades of blue. "It matches my eyes." Alexandra laughed, a sound that had become wonderfully familiar in the farmhouse. "Of course you can, sweetie." She sat beside Grace, showing her how to tie it properly. Throughout the day, they settled Alexandra's things into the rhythms of their home. Her coffee maker found a spot next to Ethan's old one in the kitchen. Her books mingled with theirs on the shelves. Her favorite blanket draped over the back of the couch, adding a touch of elegance to the comfortable living room. "The garden needs planting," Ethan mentioned as they worked. "Spring's coming fast." Alexandra's eyes lit up. "I've been reading about vegetable gardens." Grace showed me some seed catalogs. "You've never grown anything before, have you?" he asked, amused. "Unless you count office plants, which all died," she admitted, with a self-deprecating smile. "But I'm ready to learn." That evening they invited the neighbors over for dinner. The kitchen filled with warmth as Alexandra and Grace made lasagna together, following Ethan's late wife's recipe that Grace knew by heart. The familiar scent of garlic and herbs mixed with fresh-baked bread. Tom and Sarah from the hardware store arrived first, bringing a bottle of wine and stories about their son's latest letter from overseas. Miss Ruby came with one of her famous apple pies, her eyes twinkling as she noticed how naturally Alexandra moved through the kitchen now. The dining room table, extended to its full length, barely contained all the food and guests. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the clink of forks against plates. Alexandra sat between Ethan and Grace, passing dishes and joining in the town gossip as if she'd lived there all her life. "The community center's coming along beautifully," Sarah commented, helping herself to more salad. "Those art classes you started are already full." "The kids love having somewhere to go after school," Tom added. "Makes a real difference." Alexandra's cheeks flushed with pleasure. "It's everyone's hard work, not just mine. This town knows how to come together." Under the table, Ethan's hand found hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. She returned the pressure, grateful for these moments that felt so right, so natural. As the evening wore on, guests drifted home one by one, leaving behind empty dishes and warm memories. Grace helped clear the table, yawning as she stacked plates in the dishwasher. "Time for bed, sweetheart," Ethan said, noting how her eyes drooped. "You've got school tomorrow." Grace hugged Alexandra goodnight, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume that now meant home and happiness. "Don't forget, we're planting seeds tomorrow after school," she reminded them. "Wouldn't miss it," Alexandra promised, smoothing Grace's hair. Ethan led Grace upstairs, tucking her in with their usual bedtime routinia story, a kiss on the forehead, and whispered, "I love yous." When he came back downstairs, the kitchen was quiet. The dishes were done, counters wiped clean, but Alexandra wasn't there. He found her on the porch, wrapped in her favorite blanket against the lingering chill. She was gazing up at the stars, so much brighter here than in the city she'd left behind. Without a word, he joined her, their shoulders touching as they shared the blanket. Their hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining as if they'd always meant to fit together this way. The night was peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of early spring distant frogs, a gentle breeze rustling bare branches, the occasional hoot of an owl. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, both marveling at how life could change so completely, so wonderfully, in the space of a few months. Alexandra stared up at the imposing courthouse steps, her fingers tightening around the leather strap of her briefcase. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble, and despite the warmth of the spring day, she felt a chill run through her. "You've got this," Ethan said quietly beside her. His steady presence grounded her, just as it had over these past months. Grace slipped her small hand into Alexandra's free one. "We're right here with you." The gesture nearly brought tears to Alexandra's eyes. She squeezed Grace's hand, drawing strength from the girl's unwavering faith in her. Together, they climbed the steps, their footsteps echoing in the early morning quiet. Inside, the courthouse bustled with activity. Lawyers in dark suits hurried past, their shoes clicking against the polished floor. The air smelled of wood polish and anxiety. Alexandra led them to the correct courtroom, where her attorney waited outside. "Good morning, Ms. Pierce," he said, his expression confident. "Everything's in order. The evidence is overwhelming." Alexandra nodded, her throat tight. She turned to Ethan and Grace. "You don't have to stay for this part." "We're not going anywhere," Ethan said firmly. Grace nodded in agreement. The courtroom doors opened, and they filed in. Alexandra's former board members sat at the defense table, their expressions carefully neutral. She kept her head high as she walked past them, refusing to let their presence shake her. For hours, Alexandra testified about the elaborate scheme to frame her. Her voice remained steady as she detailed how they had fabricated evidence, manipulated records, and orchestrated her downfall. She described finding altered documents, discovering secret meetings, and slowly realizing the depth of their betrayal. During breaks, Ethan brought her water, and Grace drew little encouraging pictures on a notepad. Their presence made the sterile courtroom feel less hostile, less like the corporate battlefield she'd left behind. The defense attorneys tried to paint her as power-hungry and ruthless, but their questions couldn't shake her truth. She answered each accusation with calm clarity, her responses backed by solid evidence. "Ms. Pierce," one lawyer asked, his tone sharp, "isn't it true that you've made enemies throughout your career with your aggressive business tactics?" Alexandra met his gaze steadily. "I made difficult decisions as CEO, yes, but I never broke the law, and I never betrayed the trust of my company or its employees." From the gallery, she heard Grace whisper loudly to Ethan, "She's so brave." The simple comment gave her strength to continue. By late afternoon, exhaustion crept in. The prosecutors presented their final pieces of evidence, emails, financial records, and testimony from other employees who had witnessed the board's conspiracy. The weight of months of uncertainty began to lift from Alexandra's shoulders. When the judge finally called an end to the day's proceedings, Alexandra felt drained but lighter. The worst was over. The truth was out. Her attorney assured her that conviction was almost certain, given the mountain of evidence. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered with cameras and microphones. Alexandra paused at the top of the steps, Ethan and Grace flanking her protectively. "Miss Pierce, will you return to your position as CEO? What are your plans now? Do you have any comment about the charges against the board?" Alexandra raised her hand for silence. "The evidence speaks for itself," she said clearly. I'm grateful that the truth has come to light. But my future lies in a different direction now. One focused on giving back to communities that need help." She smiled slightly. "That's all I have to say today." Ethan guided them through the crowd to where his truck waited. The familiar vehicle looked charmingly out of place among the sleek city cars. Grace climbed into the middle seat, and Alexandra settled in beside her. As Ethan pulled away from the curb, Alexandra watched the courthouse shrink in the side mirror. The setting sun painted the city skyline in shades of orange and pink, beautiful, but no longer home. "You did great in there," Ethan said softly. "Those mean board people won't bother you anymore," Grace declared, snuggling against Alexandra's shoulder. Alexandra wrapped an arm around Grace, feeling the tension of the day dissolve. "No, they won't." They drove in comfortable silence as the city thinned out into suburbs, then into open countryside. Alexandra watched the familiar landmarks pass: the old grain silo, the creek bridge, the Thompsons' red barn. Each mile took her further from her old life and closer to her new one. The truck's heater hummed softly. Grace dozed between them, her breathing deep and peaceful. Streetlights gave way to starlight, and Alexandra felt the last pieces of her corporate armor fall away. "Ready to go home?" Ethan asked quietly, glancing at her. Alexandra watched the city lights fade in the distance, growing smaller until they disappeared completely behind the rolling hills. More than ready. The newly restored community center gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. Fresh paint brightened the historic brick walls, and flower boxes bursting with spring blooms lined the wide front steps. A red ribbon stretched across the entrance, waiting to be cut. Cars filled the parking lot and lined both sides of Main Street. The whole town seemed to have turned out for the grand opening. Elderly couples who'd attended events here decades ago sat in folding chairs near the front. Young families spread blankets on the lawn, their children darting between groups of chatting adults. Grace helped direct people to their seats, wearing a blue dress Alexandra had helped her pick out. She beamed with pride every time someone complimented the restoration work. Alexandra stood near the back of the crowd, her heart racing. She'd traded her usual business attire for a simple sundress that matched the casual atmosphere. Her hands fidgeted with the program as she watched Ethan adjust the microphone at the podium. The spring breeze carried the scent of lilacs from the newly planted garden. Someone had hung strings of white lights that would twinkle after sunset. The whole scene felt worlds away from boardrooms and corporate battles. Mayor Thompson stepped up first, welcoming everyone and praising the miraculous transformation of the old building. He detailed the center's history, how it had served as a gathering place for generations before falling into disrepair. Then it was Ethan's turn. He cleared his throat, glancing down at his notes before looking up at the crowd. His voice was steady but full of emotion. "This building holds a lot of memories for many of us," he began. "My late wife Sarah taught art classes here every summer. She believed this place was the heart of our community, where people could come together, support each other, and create something beautiful." He paused, his eyes finding Grace in the crowd. "After we lost her, this place stood empty. Maybe we were all a little afraid to face those memories. But Sarah always said that empty spaces were just waiting to be filled with new life." Alexandra felt tears prick at her eyes. She'd never heard Ethan speak so openly about Sarah before. "Sometimes life gives us second chances in ways we never expect," Ethan continued. "This restoration project is about more than just fixing up an old building. It's about believing that broken things can be made whole again, that what seems lost can be found in new ways." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several people wiped away tears. "I'd like to introduce someone who helped make all this possible," Ethan said, his voice warming. "She came to our town as a stranger but became family. She saw the potential here, not just in this building but in our community. Alexandra Pierce, would you please come up?" Alexandra's feet felt frozen for a moment. Then Grace appeared at her side, gently nudging her forward. The crowd parted to let her through, and suddenly she was walking toward the podium on trembling legs. As she reached the steps, something remarkable happened. People began to stand. First the front row, then spreading back through the crowd like a wave. Applause filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. These weren't the polite claps of shareholders at a board meeting. This was genuine appreciation, warm and heartfelt. Mrs. Jensen from the diner called out, "We love you, Alexandra!" Several others echoed the sentiment. Grace was clapping and jumping up and down, her face glowing with joy. Alexandra reached the podium, overwhelmed by the response. Ethan stepped aside to let her speak, but not before touching her arm gently in support. She looked out at the sea of familiar faces. People who had welcomed her, protected her, believed in her when the rest of the world hadn't. The applause continued, showing no signs of dying down. Through tears of gratitude, Alexandra caught Ethan's eye. He was smiling at her with such tenderness, such open love, that it made her heart swell. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The morning sun warmed the rich soil as Alexandra and Grace knelt side by side in the freshly tilled garden patch. Their hands were covered in dirt, and Grace's ponytail had come loose, wisps of hair framing her face as she carefully planted tomato seedlings. "Gentle with the roots," Alexandra reminded her, demonstrating how to cup the delicate plant. "They're like tiny babies that need extra care at first." Grace nodded seriously, her tongue poking out in concentration as she nestled another seedling into its new home. "Like this?" "Perfect." Alexandra smiled, watching the girl pat the soil around the plant with such tender attention. From the porch came the rhythmic sound of Ethan's hammer as he worked on the old swing, replacing worn boards and tightening loose chains. "Can we plant flowers too?" Grace asked, sitting back on her heels and wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of dirt. "Mom always loved yellow daisies." Alexandra's heart squeezed at the casual mention. "Of course we can. I think I saw some flower seeds in town yesterday. We could pick them up tomorrow?" "Yes," Grace beamed, then called out, "Dad, can we get flower seeds tomorrow?" Ethan looked up from his work, squinting against the sun. His old t-shirt had sawdust on the shoulder, and his expression softened as he took in the sight of them in the garden. "Sounds good to me, sweetheart. How about we take a break? I made lemonade." They gathered on the porch steps, passing around tall glasses of cold lemonade. Grace sat between them, her gardening gloves discarded beside her. The drink was tart and sweet, perfect for the warm spring day. "The swing's almost done," Ethan said, gesturing with his glass. "Just needs a fresh coat of paint." "Can we paint it blue?" Grace asked eagerly. "Like the sky?" Alexandra laughed. "Blue would look beautiful against the White House." "Blue it is then," Ethan agreed, reaching over to ruffle Grace's hair. "You two have been busy with that garden. What all are you planting?" "Tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers so far," Alexandra replied. "Grace wants to try growing watermelons too." "They take up lots of space," Grace explained seriously. "But Alexandra says we can train them to grow along the fence." Ethan's eyes met Alexandra's over Grace's head, warm with appreciation. "You're becoming quite the gardener, Alexandra. Never would have guessed it a few months ago. Amazing what you can learn when you trade boardrooms for vegetable plots," she said lightly, but her smile held deeper meaning. The simple joy of working with her hands, of watching things grow, had become more satisfying than any corporate victory. Grace finished her lemonade and jumped up. "Can I go check on the seedlings?" "Go ahead," Ethan said, "but stay where we can see you." They watched as Grace skipped back to the garden, her energy seemingly endless. The spring breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and distant lilacs, and somewhere a robin was singing. "She's so happy," Alexandra said softly. "I never thought I'd find this kind of peace, you know? This sense of belonging." Ethan set his glass down and turned toward her. "The foundation plans are coming along well?" Alexandra nodded. "The first round of grants will go out next month. Small business loans, educational programs, support for rural healthcare initiatives. It feels right, using what I learned in the corporate world to help communities like this one." "You're going to change lives," Ethan said with quiet certainty. "You already changed mine," she replied, meeting his gaze. "You and Grace both." From the garden, Grace called out excitedly, "Look! A butterfly on the tomatoes!" They shared a smile and watched as Grace carefully approached the plant, trying not to startle the delicate visitor. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and the air was filled with the drowsy hum of bees visiting the clover in the grass. "Want to try out that swing?" Ethan asked, standing and offering his hand. Alexandra took it, letting him pull her up. The newly repaired swing held firm as they settled onto it, starting a gentle back-and-forth motion. Grace continued her garden exploration, occasionally sharing discoveries of earthworms and interesting rocks. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Alexandra felt the tension she'd carried for so many years continue to melt away. Here, in this moment, everything felt right. She rested her head against Ethan's shoulder, feeling his arms slip around her waist. The swing creaked softly as they swayed, watching Grace in the garden, the spring evening wrapping around them like a gentle embrace. The evening air was sweet, with the scent of lilacs, as Ethan and Alexandra sat on the newly repaired porch swing. Its gentle creaking matched the rhythm of their slow swaying, a peaceful backdrop to the soft chirping of crickets. Grace darted across the lawn, chasing fireflies that had just begun their nightly dance. Alexandra kicked off her gardening shoes, wiggling her toes that were still slightly dirt-stained from their afternoon of planting. "I never thought I'd enjoy getting my hands dirty so much," she mused, watching Grace leap and spin with childlike abandon. "In my old life, gardening meant calling a landscaping service." Ethan chuckled, his arm resting comfortably along the back of the swing behind her shoulders. "And now look at you. Plotting vegetable patches and arguing with Grace about where to plant the zinnias. Those zinnias are going to be beautiful right where we put them," Alexandra defended with a playful smile. "Just you wait and see." The swing creaked softly as they watched Grace chase another firefly. The setting sun painted the sky in warm pinks and golds, casting long shadows across the farmhouse lawn. A gentle breeze carried the distant sound of neighbor Wilson's wind chimes. "You know," Ethan said thoughtfully, his voice low and tender, "when you first showed up in my truck that night, I never imagined we'd end up here." Alexandra turned to face him, her eyes soft with memory. "Neither did I. I was so lost that night. But somehow I found exactly where I needed to be." "Grace adores you," Ethan observed, watching his daughter attempt a cartwheel in the grass. "She's different since you came into our lives. Happier, more herself. She helped me remember who I used to be," Alexandra admitted, her hand finding his on the swing between them. "Before the corporate world hardened me. She has this way of seeing right through to the heart of things." "Gets that from her mother," Ethan said softly, squeezing Alexandra's hand. "Sarah always could see the best in people." Alexandra was quiet for a moment, watching Grace chase another firefly. "Do you think she would approve of this, of me?" Ethan turned to face her fully, his eyes serious but warm. "Sarah wanted Grace and me to be happy, to live fully, not just exist in her memory." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind Alexandra's ear. "You've brought light back into this house, into our lives." "You both did the same for me," Alexandra whispered, leaning slightly into his touch. "I never knew what I was missing until I found this place. Found you both." The porch swing swayed gently as Ethan drew closer, his hand cupping her cheek. Alexandra's heart quickened as she met his gaze, seeing in it all the unspoken feelings that had grown between them over these months. "Stay," he murmured, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "Not just today or tomorrow, but stay. Build this life with us." Alexandra's breath caught as Ethan leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that felt like coming home. It was gentle and sure, carrying all the warmth of spring sunshine and the promise of countless tomorrows. A delighted squeal broke through their moment. "Finally!" Grace shouted from the yard, jumping up and down with her hands clasped together. "I thought you two would never kiss." They broke apart laughing, both blushing like teenagers caught behind the bleachers. Grace bounded up the porch steps and threw herself at them both, nearly tipping the swing backward. "Does this mean Alexandra's staying forever?" Grace asked, her eyes bright with hope, as she wedged herself between them. Alexandra met Ethan's gaze over Grace's head, seeing in his smile the same joy that filled her heart. "Yes," she said softly, wrapping an arm around Grace's shoulders. "If that's what you both want?" "More than anything," Ethan answered, his arm encompassing them both as the swing rocked gently. Grace snuggled closer, sighing contentedly. "Good. Because the tomatoes need someone to take care of them, and Dad is terrible at gardening." Their laughter rang out across the twilight yard, mixing with the song of crickets and the gentle creaking of the porch swing. A few early stars winked to life in the darkening sky, bearing witness to this moment when three separate paths finally merged into one shared journey. The fireflies continued their dance across the lawn, their gentle lights matching the warm glow spilling from the farmhouse windows. In the distance, Wilson's wind chimes sang their peaceful melody, a soundtrack to this perfect spring evening when love bloomed as surely as the flowers in their newly planted garden. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you thought this was just the beginning, you're right. Click through and see where the story takes you next. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan Cole, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.